Hi, folks. Welcome back to Slipper Camp. You are now in a session called Communication and Connection in Online Classes with Martha Burtis and Hannah Hounsell. So I am going to turn it right over to them. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, so you can feel free to use that for whatever you want during this session, but I know that Martha and Hannah will be leaving lots of opportunities for questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started. I was just going to introduce myself, and I was going to ask Hannah maybe to introduce herself first.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm Hannah Hounsell. I am the learning advisor for the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative.
And I am Martha Burtis. I am the learning and teaching developer for the CoLab. I don't think I'm allowed to call myself new anymore, but I'm new. I'm newish to PSU. I only say that because there's probably some people here who I have not met before. And what we're going to be talking about today is a concern that came up a lot, I think, when the original kind of switch pivot happened in March, and continued to be expressed as an anxiety by faculty going forward. And then we saw some of that in the feedback forms that we collected, which is how, when you're working in a primarily online context with your students, do you continue to foster community? How do you build a community with authentic communication and connection happening? And I wanted to kind of mention, I've taught online for a number of years, mostly a digital storytelling class at my previous institution. And so I've done a fair amount of thinking about this, but if you came here thinking, much like many of the presentations today, if you came here thinking that we were going to be able to give you sort of the 5 rules for how you fix this or make this work, I'm sorry to say there is no magic pill or seed that we can give you to plant to foster really, really authentic online community. What we can do, though, is talk about some strategies and some techniques and some things to be thinking about as you start planning for fall term. Just to return for a minute to the ACE framework and how this intersects with that, we'll be talking a little bit about the role of student design and student choice and how that can help with fostering online community, about using the internet as an authentic ecosystem for learning, and about, of course, varied engagement of channels and how you manage that. That can certainly create opportunity for students, but it also can be challenging at times. We'll talk a little bit about some open tools that are available. And then at the institution level, obviously this intersects too with technology adoption being driven by our actual pedagogy and not just by what's the cool tech. So I wanted to throw this up. I'm not going to read these all to you, but these are some quotes that we got in the Google form that we sent out to faculty last week. I don't remember when it was. And these were some of the quotes where people expressed concern about connection and community, about students who were tuning out, hard to get in touch with them, how teaching online takes so much more time. And in particular, figuring out how to make true connections with students seems lost in all of that work, that it being more challenging, how students get overwhelmed by the different channels that they're engaging in, and maybe that's contributing to them sort of disappearing on us. And then some anxiety about, like, what's our role as faculty in terms of chasing down students, getting them to re-engage, getting them to be a member of our community. Where do we draw that line? So community, I think, for me, is really the foundation of this conversation. That I think the title was about connection and communication, but I think if we all kind of sit back and think about our classes and what in the classes we've taught that have been really, really transformative, both for us and for our students, what's been kind of the commonality. And very often, I think what people would say is that for whatever reason, that class really coalesced into a strong learning community. And so where does that come from? And so I would suggest that underneath community and what leads to community, has to first come trust, a building of mutual trust and respect between faculty and students and among students within the class themselves. And I would go beyond that and say trust really, really comes from care. It comes from how we care for ourselves, how we care for our students, and how we show that care. One of the things that I frequently hear when I talk to faculty about teaching online, not just at PSU, but in other places and at my previous institution, is you know, online can never be as good as face-to-face. People can't connect in the same way, and relationships, connections just can't be as strong or as quote unquote real. And I think it's true, people can't connect in the same way. There's a reason why these modalities are different. They really truly are kind of different experiences. Sitting in a room with someone is not the same thing as being in a Zoom conversation with them. However, I would ask anybody who's really has this anxiety and feels like this is insurmountable to sort of step back and think a little bit about your assumptions behind this, because the truth is that there are people for whom online has provided really, really rich communities. It seems a little kind of silly and cliche to say this, but many, many people in this day and age meet and ultimately spend the rest of their lives with partners who they find through online connections and online communities. I'm not suggesting that we turn our classes into dating sites, but I do think it's worth considering and acknowledging that that is possible, and trying to understand, well, why is that? How is connection really, really possible? And then I would ask you, have you ever been able to be a part of an online community? And that's not a criticism. You may have never had a need to be, or a desire to be a part of an online community in the past. Do you know other people, or other people in your life who authentically connect with others in these spaces? And could you potentially learn something from them? Can those people be sort of instructors for you in helping you to understand how these spaces can be powerful? And if this is something you're really concerned with, is there time for you to make this summer to engage in an online community, whether that's something through PSU, whether that's something personal through a social networking site like Facebook or Twitter? Could you carve out some time for yourself this summer, if this is something really does make you uncomfortable and that you kind of have qualms and doubts about, to find a way to kind of pull this practice into your life and see what works, and see how you can understand it. And ultimately, because of the time that we're talking about and what's happening right now, the connections that we're talking about fostering really do have to be mediated through some kind of technology and some kind of tool. But really the technology and the tool are only one piece of that puzzle. How you use them, how you show care, and how you build trust in those spaces is really the most important part.
Oh.
So now we're gonna get into some of the more kind of maybe practical or practice-based suggestions that you might want to think about. So this is one possibility. We've talked a lot about kind of the high flex opportunities, I hate using that word right now, the high flex necessities we may be facing come fall, or the potential that we might come back face-to-face and then not be able to stay on campus for as long as we might have planned for. If your class does start face-to-face, or you have some component of the class that is face-to-face, think about building online communication in right from the start. Even if you don't really need it because you're seeing each other, right? Think about figuring out what those environments for communication are going to be, what tools you're going to choose, what tech, and start using it immediately with your students and reinforcing that use even as you're continuing to meet face-to-face. I usually do this in classes. I didn't do this for the class I was teaching this spring, and I kind of kicked myself come March because I thought, if I had just chosen Teams or something and introduced it to the class, it would have just been one more place where I could have tried to make this community happen. Instead, we're all kind of starting from scratch, and for me at least, relying on email as the primary mode of communication. If you're introducing a new tool, take time in class to learn it together. I think a lot of faculty, and myself included, it's a little nerve-wracking, the idea of, I'm going to use Teams in my class, but I don't know everything about how Teams works. So before I could possibly introduce it, I've got to become an expert in Teams. I have to become Melinda. And that's really not true if you approach this a little differently. If you approach this with a little bit more of a attitude of experimentation, and inviting your students into that experimentation. So doing a class session where you literally are like, all right, today we're going to figure out how Teams works, and we're going to figure out how we're going to use it. We're going to, spend some time playing around, clicking buttons, breaking things, fixing things, and then making some rules for ourselves about how we're going to share, what we're going to share. We're going to set up different channels. Are there apps we want to investigate? And turning that a little bit more into a class activity that you engage in with your students. What about choosing a tool? There was a lot of conversation in the previous session about Teams that I think circled around this. How do you pick the tool? So I don't think, again, that there's any magical solution to this, and anybody who knows me will know that I'm not somebody who would say the solution is we all should get on board and use the same thing the same way for all of our classes. I think that there's temptation in that, and I can talk a little bit about why I don't think that's the best approach. What I think is a better approach is figuring out what works for you and for your class, and what you can make work for you in your class. So if you're looking at something and it really, like if you're looking at Teams and it makes you feel super uncomfortable, maybe you spend some time this summer trying to do more work with it and you still are like, I'm so overwhelmed by this, that's probably not a good choice for you. It probably particularly isn't a good choice for you in a semester that's likely to be a little fraught like this past semester. Maybe don't add something to the mix that's likely to increase your anxiety and increase your concern around these issues. But when choosing, these are the kinds of things you need to make a decision about. Do you want something that's really familiar or something that's new? Is privacy and a private closed space for your class important? Or would you be interested in maybe having your students work in the open and on public and in public spaces? Institutional versus fun and playful. Sometimes people don't really notice that, but there are definitely some tools that feel a little bit more like a colleague of mine used to say, like the waiting room in the doctor's office, as opposed to a playground. So picking a tool that, and maybe you're the waiting room kind of person, and that makes you feel comfortable and you think that's what your students have come to expect, okay, then go with that. You're probably going to use that better. But if you're more of the playground person, maybe finding a space that feels more like the playground is a better way. Perhaps picking no more than 2 spaces where you're going to engage with your students and being really intentional about how you're going to use those and for what. Oh, and trying not to overuse email. We heard a lot from students who just said their email inboxes were completely overwhelmed. And I'm going to turn this over to Hannah now. I think she's going to take it from here on creating community.
Yes, I will take it from here. And I want to apologize. There's some construction on my apartment. So if you hear hammering, it's not my cat. So I'd love to kind of explore this question of creating community in classrooms. And I think we all can kind of relate to this feeling that some classes, like in face-to-face classes, just work. And I'd wager to kind of ask us to question that kind of line of thinking and think about that professors are actually facilitators of community, whether they realize it or not. And Martha and I really believe that community and establishing community is also a matter of establishing trust. And at the end of the slide, I'd really love to open the floor to folks to share experiences where like trust and community blossomed for them, either in a face-to-face or online setting. And if you'd like to share those in chat, you can feel free to do that, but we'd love to open the floor for 1 or 2 people to talk about that. But yeah, trust is the basis of community. And how does trust form for people? And we say that giving students an opportunity for informal, fun, authentic ways to connect with each other can help establish a space that students feel comfortable in, because I think we often forget academic space is really scary space for students. And maybe it's even scarier too when it's online, because there's this feeling of permanence, like a Zoom could be recorded and people are looking back on that Zoom and, you know, everyone's really tuned in and it's just unfamiliar. So kind of establishing those ways for students to take place, engage in safe, kind of fun ways, low stake ways to help kind of build bravery. And community requires trust in the end. So how do we kind of form and build that trust? And I'd love if there's anybody who'd like to jump in and talk about a time when they felt that community blossomed either online or in person, and why that community blossomed. If anybody wants to unmute their mics. Don't all jump at once.
Sure. So what's interesting about nursing is that we have cohorts that move through. So as the sophomores begin to rise, we get to know them. And so as I was just typing, one way that I do that is to create a letter chain between the student and I. And sometimes there's 30, sometimes there's 50. It just depends how many people. So we share back and forth, and then we can find some commonalities. For example, one of the students sent me a picture and she said, describe this picture to me. And I said, I know exactly where that picture is. That's Maidstone Lake in Vermont. She's like, oh my gosh, you've been there. So I think you have these moments to be able to, and that was asynchronous when they had time, asynchronous for me when I had time, but I really got to know my students and to make connections. And she's still sending me pictures of Maidstone Lake, and you know, people know I like cats, and people that love cats, or maybe people hate cats, and people send me really interesting pictures because they're dog people. So we have a dog versus cat war. So I think that's one way to try to create a sense of community and to get to know your students well.
Yeah, great, thank you. Becky Noel also put in the chat that she had a check-in forum that kind of counted equally as a forum post. And it was just a way for students to kind of check in during the week and say if they're doing okay. Even that small, whoop, did I hear someone else?
I can chime in. This is Jason
Sure.
Ninos. So I had one of the last classes I taught at ASU. I felt like actually we built a really strong community, and it was one of the few times I actually cried when my teaching was over with them, because I knew I was, you know, we were all going to miss each other. And like you talked about, it really was being authentic and being informal is what helped establish that trust with them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I let them, you know, I was always upfront with them, you know, this is me, this is I gave them windows of my life, and I talked about myself, my hobbies, that I have 3 kids and things like that. They got to know me as a person and not just me as the instructor who they come and we talk about educational technology.
Yeah.
And so by the end of the semester, yeah, we had established a community, and I've always tried to foster that community of, you know, any questions on the table, we're all here trying to learn, and I can learn just from you guys just as much as you can learn from me. And it really established that this was a learning community, not just me teaching them, but we're all learning this together.
Thanks, Jason. So just in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next
I have
one.
something.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. We can have one more in there.
One more?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Lori Reed. I taught first year tackling wicked problem last fall for the first time, and I had 32 students. And what I found really, really connecting for me as well as the students was toward the end of the semester, I asked the students if they would feel comfortable having giving their addresses to me and their parents' names. And I know everyone can't do this, but I was only teaching one class. So I actually hand wrote thank you notes to all the parents for sending their child to Plymouth State University, and what a pleasure that student was, and something very personal about the student. And the parents actually responded. I received a few cards back from parents saying, thank you so much, I've been worried. And I intend on doing that to any of the students again who, the students thought it was kind of cool. And the parents, it was just very, very, very rewarding. And I think it was just special for me to be able to do that.
Wonderful. So moving forward, I think ways that we can think about maybe taking those face-to-face experiences and finding what was it that made that community grow, and kind of thinking about ways that that can transfer to an online community is maybe something that we can start thinking about as we think about what fall is going to look like. I also want to talk about being patient, and this is kind of going to this idea that at the basis community is trust, but also is care for students and for yourself as well. And I definitely encourage folks to be patient as students navigate these uncharted waters. Multiple students will probably ask you the same question multiple times. And this is super frustrating for all of us who work so hard on clarity and putting information in all of the crevices of the internet that we possibly can. So it's really hard to get those questions and get the same questions over and over again. But I always like to think of it as like, answer every question from a student like it's the first time hearing that question, because for the student, it is the first time they've asked that question. And it's overwhelming for them. An easily linked FAQ could be a solution if you're getting questions over and over again, that you could just send the link to students for them to look at. We can go on to the next slide. And then of course, caring for yourself too. I saw in the Teams chat especially, there is like some, a sense of being overwhelmed or frustrated, and that is totally valid. This is tricky, this is new territory. Most of us know our way around face-to-face communities and how to build those, but this is new. And actually, I'd wager to say that for many students, they might actually have the upper hand with this stuff because they have already had some online experiences in communities that we might not have. And if you're comfortable doing so, you could follow their lead, and that could lead to some really interesting, unexpected, exciting, experimental, all the adjectives, stuff happening in your class. I don't know who was telling me about this. It might have been Martha. A faculty took a poll of their class and found out that all the students use Discord. So he set up a Discord, which is kind of like a online chatting forum-y community. And that might have not been, that might have been a new experience for the faculty member, but the students were kind of leading the faculty member. And of course, stuff might not work too. That is not a failure on your part. And you can move forward. You can get rid of the tech that didn't work. You can ask students what you should do moving forward. It's not failure on your part. So have some care for yourself and understanding for yourself. And moving on to the next one, I just want to talk momentarily about disappearing students as well. I personally struggled with this issue as an advisor to 100 students or so. And it really takes an emotional toll on you as an advisor or faculty member to see students kind of dropping off and not knowing about them and wondering if there's health issues or basic needs issues involved with their disappearance. And as Rochelle Lyons spoke of yesterday, that is a very real thing right now, is that students could be losing, could be not properly fed, they could be having health issues, their families could be working in a hospital and have a lot of uncertainty. And for this reason, I really encourage you guys to start your communications to these students with care first and schoolwork second. Students can also develop a lot of anxiety and shame about coming back after they've disappeared. It's kind of a vulnerable situation for them to find themselves in, but it means everything to a student to have a professor demonstrate kindness first. And then of course, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have these strategies in place to deal with disappearing students in face-to-face situations too, with email, with looping in advisors on emails, with using EAB texting tools, filling out care forms. So we don't have to, we can use those strategies that we've already developed in face-to-face situations.
I just, there was one other point here that I want to make, because Hannah's the one who always reminds me of it, which is also knowing when you've done everything that you can do. And I think we face that a lot, feeling like maybe there's something else I could have done or should have done. I have a student I am dealing with this like as we speak. Just got a text finally, and wondering today if I was just going to have to give up. But that's hard. But to a certain degree, we do have to accept that our power only goes so far. Keeping track, this is kind of a pragmatic approach or a pragmatic point, but I want to make it, it's something that I do in every class I teach, which is having some way of tracking student engagement, not in like a creepy, stalky, surveillance-y kind of way, but more in just kind of logging and tracking interactions with my students, especially if you teach a lot of students. I know some of our faculty with heavy loads are teaching 100+ students a semester. That's impossible to keep track of in your head. It's not you. That's just impossible. So even just having a spreadsheet or something where you log, heard from so-and-so, checking in again on the day, and knowing that you can go back and look at that when you forget, because you will inevitably forget, because it is impossible. All right, so moving on a little bit more to tools and tech. I'm not going to read you all of this. It was kind of a silly slide to put together because honestly, the possibilities are endless in terms of what you could use as technology to create a space for community. We've already talked about some of those today, Teams being one of them, Moodle being another one. Hypothesis has come up a couple times in chat, and sometimes people don't think of that as like a community building tool, but you certainly could use group annotation as a way to foster conversation and interaction among your students. I've seen that done really successfully and actually kind of playfully in ways that can be very effective. Texting apps, there's lots of them out there that allow you to set up group texts. Sometimes students really like that because it's a little bit lower threshold. It's not in your email. It feels more like texting. They're very familiar with that modality. And then this last one is important. The phone works. As Travis was telling us this morning with Zoom, you can call into a Zoom. But sometimes just reaching out by phone, especially if you have a student who's dealing with internet or bandwidth issues. I used it this spring for students. None of these are the perfect tool for you or for all of us. None of these are the right choice. The right choice for you has to do with your needs, your comfort level, your students' needs, your students' comfort level. I wanted to put this in here. Why didn't I mention Zoom in that slide? Partly because we've talked about Zoom a lot, but also because it's important to recognize with all of these tools, both their what they can do and what they can't do. So what are their advantages and their limitations? Zoom's big limitation is that it requires synchronicity. It requires students to be available at the same time in order for that connection to happen. We heard from lots of people today and in the forum that some students really, really liked that kind of connection in Zoom. It felt more natural. It felt more like what they were used to. So by no means are we saying never use Zoom, but maybe it's something you need to balance a little if you have some students for whom Zoom isn't possible for whatever reason, maybe because of work-life balance issues, maybe because of internet issues. So figuring out, you don't want Zoom to be the place where all community building happens and then you've got 3 students who are kind of left out in the cold. So with all of these tools, doing a little bit of thinking about what are the advantages and disadvantages and how do you balance those against what you're trying to achieve in your class. A lot of people express concern about this. How do we keep from overwhelming our students with technology? And sometimes the response is, shouldn't we all just use the same thing and restrict options? I have a lot of thoughts about this. And in times that aren't the context of a global pandemic, I would probably be a little bit more forceful about some of those thoughts. But here's what I'll say at this point, which is that students and many of us actually can and do live and thrive in lots of technology contexts. We're able to do that and they're able to do that when those contexts feel authentic and valuable and communal and important. So I have a teenager, if I watch her, she jumps around from app to app, context tool to tool. There's no anxiety about that. She's not getting overwhelmed by that because that is so richly, authentically important to her. Now, can we do that for all of our students in all of our classes in you know, a very short amount of time when nobody's really expecting, the students aren't really expecting that in their classes. Probably not. But what you can do is figure out what's authentic and valuable for this class that would work for me and that I feel comfortable doing. So I think our engagement with tech should be collaborative and experiment and critical and careful. It needs to be full of care, which means sometimes saying, gosh, that would be such a cool tool to use, but I'm not going to do it because it's too much for me. It's too much for those 3 or 4 students in my class who don't really have the bandwidth, either real or mental, to adjust to it. So I'm going to simplify. I'm going to skip these just in the interest of time. And like in the moment of a global pandemic, that's probably not the time for us to be saying, I'm going to push myself harder and further than I've ever pushed myself before, and my students too. Instead, it's the time to be really critical and careful about our choices. If you think you can do the new tech pedagogy, if you're up for this, you want to spend the summer really diving into it, getting comfortable, learning this, and you feel like I'm okay with this being a little experimental, go for it. You should do that. But if that feels like a bridge too far for you, as it's been pointed out, that's my favorite phrase. If that feels like a bridge too far for you, then don't cross the bridge. Stick with the things that are going to feel comfortable and usable for you, because you know what, you're going to be able to be more authentic in those spaces. And if you're more authentic, you're more likely to be able to build trust with your students, which is more likely to lead to strong community. This last slide, we just wanted to kind of bookend with a few of the things people said that were really positive. Robin mentioned this coming into the presentation, that yes, there were concerns, but it was really kind of wonderful to see the number of faculty who had great things to say about how they were able to interact and connect with their students this spring. And I put this up here mostly just so that everybody understands we're all in this together. The people in this room with you, your peers, your colleagues, they've been through this with you. Many of them may have advice. They may have learned something from this experience that they can share. And so don't be afraid to reach out to us for help, but reach out to your own community to talk about what strategies might work. And that's it. And we're going to stop and ask for questions. And I haven't been looking at the chat, so I have no idea what questions there are.
There's been lots in the chat. Ben, I don't know if you have anything collected, and you can feel free to unmute. Otherwise, we'll ask folks to just chime in.
Yeah, I have a few. The first one actually refers way back to the beginning of the presentation, as that tool orientation assignment thing you were talking about, Martha.
Yeah.
Is that like a class activity, or do you do that entirely online, or how do you go about that?
So yeah, in that particular slide, I was specifically talking about if we do have the opportunity to be with our students for some amount of time face to face, that's a great time to actually do that in class if you can make time and space for it. Just because you can kind of have fun and figure it out together in the same room, but there's no reason why that couldn't be facilitated online. It would be a different experience facilitated online, but I still think you can. I always like to do these like assignments with my students that are almost like scavenger hunts with technology, where I'll be like, who can figure out how to do this, and who can figure out how to do that, and I'll literally come up with a list of like half a dozen like challenges, and then just say, you can't make a mistake. Like, I mean, you can't break it. Just go figure it out. Let's see what we learn, and then come back and tell us what you figured out.
A follow-up question on that from Liz, who asked the original question.
Yeah, not even just a follow-up. I just think my anxiety is already sort of high around when we're doing it together, when everyone manages to bring their laptops and we can all sit next to each other and I can move around and point at stuff and be like, wow, I don't know. Do you know? Like, and so that sharing, that proximity, and I'm not thinking about it romantically. I'm thinking about it as very practical.
Yeah.
And as the times that I've done that have really relied on the students being able to help each other out in ways that involved like pointing at things on screens for each other and grouping together. And so I just, the closest
experience I can relate to this is when I do my digital storytelling class, which is really tech intensive. We don't hold back from what we ask students to learn tech wise in that class. It's entirely online though. We never meet with them face to face. And so for that class, the last couple of times I've taught it, we have used Slack, which is a lot like Teams, for kind of informal chat space. And it's, once the students get comfortable with it, it's pretty neat to see them giving each other, like, because they ask questions, I don't know the answer to that question. And they'll tag each other and ask for help, and use it as a way to facilitate what you're describing. I won't disagree with you though. There's a reason why it doesn't feel the same, because it's not the same. You know,
I'm okay with it being different. I'm just
yeah.
worried about not being able to help.
Yeah.
in the way that I know how to help, which is actually not even that much, which is literally like, I don't know, let's ask this person sitting next to you, what's on your screen? What happens when you push this button? Oh my God, something different happens when you push that button. And then, so
mostly mostly when my students ask me for help, even when I know an answer, when they're with me, I Google it, because that's how I learned everything.
Right, you want to model that too.
So I think I understand that anxiety. I think giving yourself a little bit of space to just say, I have no idea, let's Google it together and see what we find. Students sometimes are comforted by that in a weird way too. Thanks. Other questions?
Martha, this is Rochelle. I have a question about any recommendations or suggestions for how we can provide a space for students to have some community exchange without us necessarily being in there, because in this remote setting, they don't have that chance for some of that sort of casual exchange that might happen right before you enter the classroom or as class is wrapping up. And I think that's an important piece. And I'm not sure if we can somehow provide that, or if that's just like way beyond our scope of possibility.
I think that's a great question. And I would say, like in the synchronous space, like in Zoom, for example, it is possible to set up your meetings in Zoom so that you don't have to be there for the meeting to start, which is always a little bit like disorienting. You probably want to warn your students, because they'll go in and be like, wait a minute, am I supposed to be here? But there's no particular reason why you couldn't let students gather in there and you wait to join them. When I teach online, I teach almost entirely asynchronously. I don't really use a whole lot of synchronous stuff. And so again, tools that allow for kind of informal conversation like Teams or Slack, I find really useful for that. But that's a little bit different than the gathering space, mimicking the gathering space of a face-to-face class. But it's interesting how students begin to use that in similar ways for kind of informal, quote unquote, water cooler conversation.
So I've got a couple questions here about texts. So can we use a group chat like WhatsApp? Are there legal implications to using non-PSU apps? Are there pros, cons, better apps for this? And then why is EAB better than emails? And why do students tend to respond better to that?
Do you want to talk about EAB, Hannah?
Yeah, I can talk about EAB a little bit. And I've seen a lot of great conversation going on in the chat that I'm not even going to pretend that I can answer some of these questions, honestly, especially involving FERPA and that sort of thing. But I use EAB as an advisor because I find that students get overwhelmed with email, and especially during the COVID emergency, their email was just getting full of stuff every day. So I use EAB to text students because it sends them something to their phone that kind of breaks through a little bit the monotony of like all of the emails coming in all the time, so overwhelming. But I usually just use EAB to say, hey, this is Hannah from IDS. I sent you a really important email that I need you to look at. So I actually usually don't use it at all to discuss, private information or something that could potentially be have some issues around FERPA. And usually that works. They usually say, oh, hey, I'll check out that email, and they do. So that was my little EAB spiel.
Yeah, in terms of other tools, so I'm not a lawyer. I won't pretend to be one. If there's anyone in the room who is a lawyer who'd like to weigh in, they should do so. But my general feeling about using other tools, like for example, when I used Slack at my institution, that wasn't an institutionally provided tool, that was extra institutional. And actually we used things like Twitter as well. mostly what that means from my perspective is you don't share grades. Like you don't use WhatsApp or Twitter or Teams or Slack. Definitely not to publicly put grades on work, and probably not even to privately put grades on work. I would save that for more institutionally sanctioned channels for legal reasons. But for conversation, I don't know why there would be a reason why we can't have conversation and commune with students in other kinds of spaces. To me, that's the equivalent of saying we couldn't decide to hold class, you know, off campus because of a field trip, for example. Like we couldn't go on a field trip. So again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. So, but that's kind of my perspective.
I wanted to respond to what Laura just put in the chat about, so I'll switch to text and then we overwhelm them with text. And yeah, absolutely, there is that concern.
Don't overuse EAB either.
Yeah, I really use it just for the students that I've emailed 4 times and that have disappeared off the face of the planet.
There used to be this sort of term that got thrown around in my discipline, in my circle, called creepy treehouse syndrome, which is like, what is it when we as faculty or, you know, adults go into the spaces where students are used to it being their own space, like a treehouse. And so like, what is that boundary of us going into their texts or going into their Facebook or going into whatever tool it is, their TikTok? I think it's a really tricky boundary. And I honestly don't think it's a black and white thing. I think it depends so much on you, your relationship with your students, and being really aware of it and ready to pivot if for some reason it seems like maybe you have crossed a boundary or you've made students uncomfortable, which is another reason why I think having a conversation with your students right out of the gate about, hey, I'm thinking of using this as our primary means of communication. What do people think? Are there other things you would suggest? How should we conduct ourselves in these spaces? I think that's never a bad idea.
I just want to alert folks that we are down to our last 3 minutes for this particular session. Does anybody have a final question that's pressing that you wanted to pop in before we leave? I think I see a hand from Whitney, because I can only see 5 of you, so she gets it. Go ahead, Whit. Oh, you're muted. Yep. Oh, you're still muted. I can unmute you. Hold on. Nobody can unmute you. Hold on.
Thank you. Am I muted?
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm thinking about ways that we check in each class with students, and like having a writing prompt, but also the ability, if we're Zooming or doing a live team discussion, is there a place in Teams where students could share a writing prompt that would sort of archive that, and then we could still have people who wanted to read their check-in could, but then they could also be archived? Is that something that people have tried to do?
What's your thought, Hannah? I mean, you could definitely do a channel in Teams that's just kind of like weekly prompts, and you could do threaded discussion in Teams. So every student goes in, puts their thought, other people can reply. It's not going to go anywhere, so it's archived in that sense. I will say that much like any chat tool, it can quickly, you can quickly find that it's left you behind.
Yeah, right.
So you have to be aware of that, but as long as the goal isn't everybody read everything,
Right.
the goal is more like dip in, see what's there, respond, move on. I think that could work well.
Thank you.
For those of you who are in the Cluster Pedagogy Learning Community, the CPLC, we're actually jumping from Moodle, which is what we used for the first cohort, to Teams for the second cohort, and trying out some of these channels as a way of facilitating some of the internal conversations. So for those who are in that group, it actually might be kind of an interesting beta test, because the CPLC is a little more like a class than a committee, I think. With that, I just want to thank Martha and Hannah so much, and all of you for coming. I'm going to stop recording now.